Hello and welcome to this IOE Coffee Break about helping young children with their primary to secondary school transition under Covid-19. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Dr. Sandy Leaton-Gray, Associate Professor of Education at the Institute of Education, and I'm your chair this afternoon. I'm also the Principal Investigator for the Moving Up project, which has looked specifically at children's experiences of moving from primary to secondary school over the last year or so during the pandemic, and we'll be largely drawing from it for this discussion, and I'm particularly interested to hear your questions, so please do send them in. Once I've introduced our speakers, I'll kick things off with a couple of questions, but as I say, we're here to respond to your thoughts and queries, so please share those throughout using the question and answer function on Slido. You can also tweet about the discussion using the hashtag IOE Coffee Breaks. So to introduce our speakers, we have Eleanore Hargreaves, Professor of Learning and Pedagogy at the Institute of Education. Eleanor's research has provided rich insights into children's experience of schooling across a number of countries. As well as the aforementioned Moving Up study, her projects include surveys of children about their learning and a 5-year in-depth study of 23 children's journeys through schooling from age 7 to age 12. And alongside Eleanor, we have Dr. Jane Perryman, Associate Professor at the Institute of Education. Prior to joining the IOE, Jane was a social science teacher and head of department for 10 years, before moving into higher education as a teacher educator. Jane's research covers various aspects of schooling, including teachers' professional lives, as well as accountability, performativity and inspection, as well as policy enactment more generally. Now, I'm going to move straight into some questions now. And I thought it'd be useful to start by looking at school transition under what was the old normal, if you like, before the pandemic, before all the disruptions associated with COVID. Eleanor and Jane, what were the main steps for children and teachers in that process? Eleanor, would you like to answer?
Yes, I think that the normal way it used to be was that the secondary school would make an effort to put on an induction day for the year 6 children. They would go and spend a day in their new school and get a feel for it. And it might also work the other way around, that the year 7 teachers might visit the primary school as well. And the whole idea was to make the children familiar with the situation so that they didn't feel too scared about the unknown.
And Jane, do we know anything about how children felt about that under the old system?
The process as it was, Sandy?
Yeah.
Yes, well, I think they very much welcomed it, because I think that one of the main fears for children is of the unknown, and the more they got to know what the new school was going to be like, particularly the geography of the place, the more comforted they were.
On the other hand, I had one year 6 child tell me the other day that she'd been visited by her secondary school teachers, and now she was terrified because they'd said, don't worry, all the other people will be much taller than you, and it will be it might be quite terrifying. So that wasn't perhaps the most appropriate thing for them to say, although they were obviously trying to prepare her.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get right, isn't it? I'm now, obviously this kind of transition has been through unprecedented change, and I'm just wondering about a few aspects of that, what we found in our study. So Jane, perhaps you could talk to me a little bit about what schools used to collect in terms of data on pupils' prior attainment and what they try to do now.
Well, obviously the main source of data was from the SATs exams, which, as we know, were cancelled last year and have been cancelled. And they would also collect data from the schools about the pupils in general. And I think that one of the important things that they used to do was the year 7 teachers and the year 6 teachers would actually have informal conversations about those students, because, as we know, you don't pick up everything about a student just from numbers on paper. Now, obviously, the SATs have been cancelled, so they didn't have the same level of assessment data to look at. And also, they didn't really have the same opportunities to talk to the students, the teachers of the students either. So when the year 6 arrived into year 7 this year, they were very much more of an unknown quantity. I think a lot of schools organised their own testing regimes to see the scores. But again, it's very difficult for them to get the more informal information that they usually have.
And Jane, wouldn't, sorry, Sandy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so it sounds like they did their best, but it was less an ideal situation.
Yeah,
Carry on, Eleanor.
I was just going to say, I think there isn't one way though. I think it's always been very varied. So I know that some schools don't use SATs results at all, whereas other schools do use them to some extent, although my understanding is all schools do have their own testing. But I think the extent to which secondary teachers and primary school teachers used to talk to each other was probably very varied across schools, and what their culture was like and how sensitive they were to children's needs. So I don't think there was ever a one rule for all.
And what about things like, you know, the kind of celebrations that children have at the end of primary school, and trips and so on? I mean, how did people report that changed?
They just didn't happen as far as we know. I mean, don't forget that right up until the beginning of June, we were actually in total lockdowns, and then schools opened in a very, very limited way. So all the planned balls, some schools have leaving balls and celebration days and everything. None of those happened. And I'm a bit concerned that they won't be happening this year either, because as the opening up of society isn't now happening until July 19th, it looks like another year we'll miss out on all that celebration as well.
Yes, and it's a worry, isn't it? Because you think, well, you know, these are really core times to bond with other young people, and you know, I just worry, I suppose, that you know, at some point, hopefully we'll come out of the pandemic, but you know, you've lost all of those opportunities. And you know, the closer young people get to sort of doing GCSEs and things like that, the more emphasis there is on curriculum teaching, and perhaps a bit less time for trips and adventures. So I'm a little bit worried that will never happen again, but hopefully that's too negative a view, and schools will have all of that in hand, of course. So
Could I say,
Eleanor, I was
Sandy,
going to say about the sort of social and emotional well-being and general adjustment. What do you think about that then? How do you think that's been impacted?
how it's been impacted by COVID? Okay, so I mean, I think what you were talking about, the fact that those fun activities and projects that didn't happen last year meant that the emphasis was on SATs right up to the last minute, and then they were cancelled, and then it was a lockdown. So those children have missed out, because schools try to make up for the sort of tunnel vision for exams prior to that period, and then in that period they provide lots of wonderful, creative, dramatic, geographical events, and those didn't happen. And I think it's really sad, and I think it is a huge loss. And what we've noticed from the children in the Moving Up study is when they got into secondary school, they found there still were no trips, and there was still no, lots of sporting events were cancelled, after school clubs were cancelled. So they went to secondary school thinking, oh, I'm definitely going to join the chess club or whatever. And then when they got there, they found there was no chess club. And that was something that the children in our survey mentioned over and over again.
Yeah, it's a really key part of being an older child, isn't it? An older person. This idea that you've got more choice, and you move around the building more, and you have more choice of all of these wonderful activities. And you know, and you can have different friendship groups as well, and they've ended up sometimes with just the year group or the class group as their friendship base, and not much mixing with the other children of different age groups, which a lot of them have said they were looking forward to. So you know, it's tough, but I think that they seem to be coping. I mean, what do you think, Jane? Do you think that they've managed it well, the transition during the pandemic?
I think it depends. It depends on the children. A lot of it depends on their family circumstances. I mean, some children I think had a marvelous time in lockdown, doing exciting projects and exploring their learning as they wanted to, if they had the technology and the support to do that. And also, I think some children, as we discovered, some children thrive possibly being a more independent learner and working on their own. And also in terms of personality types, I think probably children who are sort of shyer and quieter probably appreciate being in school in smaller groups and smaller bubbles and not being thrown into the massive secondary school situation. I think overall children are very resilient, and this is the situation that they are in, and they are used to it. But there have been, I think, casualties as well as some positives.
I'd like to ask you a different question, if I may. And I'm just wondering if you think that the unusual circumstances this year provide an opportunity for schools to attempt new approaches to managing transition and to learn for future years, maybe when social distancing and lockdowns are a fading memory, if that ever happens. What do you think?
Well, we very much hope so, don't we? It would be great if there was a silver lining to the rather difficult past 18 months. One ray of hope that I see is that some of the children have talked about not being put into so-called ability sets when they get to year 7 because of the COVID issues. And that is likely to be of great benefit, especially to those children who would have been put in lower sets. I don't know how widespread that is, but certainly, I mean, the research evidence is very strong, suggesting that ability grouping, however you want to call it, is very damaging to everybody except the people who do best in their tests. So if that was an outcome and it was people were more in their community bubbles or smaller classes and not mixing all the time, I think that could be very beneficial for some children.
Yes, and what do you think, Jane?
I think more widely, I'm just wondering to what extent there will be change as a result of this in education, because we've been stuck in our groove for years and years. There's been this big change and an opportunity to do things differently. And if you look at other aspects of education, such as, exams and teacher assessments and everything like that, there did seem to be an opportunity to do it quite differently. And what has happened is they've done it as close as possible, but with much more work for the teachers as the previous issue. So yes, like Eleanor, I mean, I would really hope that we could look at how to do this differently, because also, unfortunately, we don't know how long this is going to go on for. I mean, hopefully this may be the last year that students won't be having a proper transition to secondary school, but perhaps this will be happening again next summer. I'm a ray of light, aren't I?
It would be great, Sandy, if I could just add, we've had 2 years with no SATs, and I think we might have realised that SATs really, the only purpose they serve is accountability of the school, and that they don't support the children. In fact, they do a lot of damage to a lot of children. So if that perception becomes strong enough to affect policy, I mean, that would be absolutely wonderful. We could finally get rid of tests at the end of primary. We'll see. There are many groups fighting for that.
I think a lot of countries do some kind of testing, but it's in Britain where it's very intense, isn't it? It becomes a sort of national nervous breakdown, the whole SATs thing. Maybe, yeah, there's a question, there's a sort of purpose for softening things at the edges and making it more about the children, like you say. I've got some very interesting questions coming in from members of the public. And I'm wondering, do we know if teachers get any specific training or guidance for supporting prospective year 7s? Are you aware of any, Eleanor?
The only training that I'm aware of them getting is for the catch-up classes. So the government's put a lot of money into this catch-up regime with mentors. But from my point of view, that
I think in a general sense,
yeah,
I've trained as a teacher. I can't remember having any specific training at any point.
no, I'm not aware of anything else. No.
Do you know of any, Jane?
No, not offhand. I mean, I wonder, because I've dealt in secondary training, so I'm just wondering, maybe if you're training in primary school specifically for the upper years, you may be trained in that. But it's almost the other way around. It's the year 7 teachers that need to be trained in how to deal with these disorientated and bewildered children.
Well, on the other hand, I think year 6 teachers are a certain breed of person, and they're put in year 6 because it's felt that they would be very suitable for preparing children for year 7. So although it's not a training, I think year 6 teachers deserve a lot of credit for doing their own training, if you like.
Absolutely. And one of the things that came through from the data from the year 6 teachers that we spoke to in the project was how upset they were for their children. They'd got very, very close to them, and they were really upset they didn't have all the usual opportunities they could have.
Yes.
So and again this year.
Yes.
Yeah, it's certainly difficult times. And we've got a question from Sarah, who's asking, do we have any views on the adequacy or balance of the government's catch-up provisions? She says they do include some of the fun, but important activities that we've mentioned. But what do we think about that in general? Eleanor?
Well, my project is working with children who are likely to have missed more school than some other, my other project, not the Moving Up project, the one that's following children through primary school. And for those children who are the ones who might struggle more with some subjects than other children, for them to have catch up during break, after school, in the summer, it's exactly what they don't need. So having sort of missed out on the security of having school last summer and in earlier lockdown this year, what they need is lots of care and attention to their person, but to give them more formal lessons, which they already struggle with, I think could backfire. So I'm actually quite concerned about this, and I know that some schools will do it brilliantly and very sensitively, but really a lot of those children would like a lot less time in school, not more time.
What do you think, Jane? I mean, what did we find out in the project?
About the catch-up programmes.
I'm not sure. What did teachers want or feel that
well, again, I mean, many teachers are very concerned about how far children may or may not have fallen behind, and I'm not sure we have the data about how much they actually had. A lot of the teachers seemed more concerned about their mental health than about how their attainment had failed. And as Eleanor says, if what is good for their mental health is not being made to do catch-up classes, then I think that's probably an important message.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think I remember from our latest report is that we use the words fragmented a lot, and the idea of cohorts being fragmented, so that it wasn't an input-output model where, you know, less learning had gone in and so there was less of something else coming out. That actually what had happened is an equilibrium had gone in some senses, so that some children were, you know, they'd made really good progress, particularly deprived children who had been in school during lockdown because they were free school meals, or maybe they had special education needs or something like that. So they were in school being taught in very small cohorts and thrived. And then other children who maybe didn't have internet, couldn't go into school, didn't have much support at home, or the parents were busy trying to hold down jobs and couldn't homeschool all day, every day. It was much more difficult, and you know, their learning might have fallen behind a bit, but it's often not quite how you'd predict it. And I think that's going to be really difficult for policymakers moving forwards, because it's just not an automatic correlation, and it's difficult to know where to put the resource and how. I was quite encouraged when the sort of catch-up plans were elaborated, and they were talking about things like the social side. Because I think that was one of the biggest reasons you go to school is to mix with other people your own age. You can do quite a lot of the other stuff at home if you want to homeschool, but you can't mix with other young people. And that was something that I think a lot of our teachers seem to express concern about, And so I was very keen to see that embedded, and I hope there's some provision for that moving forwards, maybe. I'm looking at more questions from members of the public now, and staying with you, Jane, they're asking, did our research find anything surprising regarding the impact on teachers as opposed to children? I know your particular area of research expertise is in teachers and their careers.
I think well, it's not surprising, but I think the biggest impact on teachers has been their increasing expertise in technology, because I think that was a swift, short, sharp learning curve that they all had to go through last March and April. I think it's been that the teachers in our survey showed extreme care for their students, and I think they've been emotionally affected by it in many ways, as much as their students have, just from that feeling of helplessness and not being able to do their job properly. And I also think that the autumn term was particularly difficult for teachers, because at it was neither online nor at school. Speaking anecdotally, my son's school has got 9 form classes, and in October, November, there were at least 2 classes off self-isolating every week, and then they would come back and another class would go out. And that must have been a nightmare for teachers, because you're either teaching proper lessons or you're doing online learning. It's very difficult to manage both at once, I think. I also think there's an interesting new expectation on teachers. Again, anecdotally, and we had a teacher training day last week, and all the parents were going, oh, so are they having online lessons? And it's like, well, no, that's not what happens on teacher training days. But it's like,
we're not there, guys.
My child's off school, where is the suite of learning? So I think managing expectations is quite difficult as well.
Right. Yeah, when you think about that kind of model and that kind of blended learning model and so on, I mean, it's really needs to be super served and is super expensive, and it's a sort of high-end university provision that's really quite, I mean, it's a sort of MBA level provision, isn't it, that people would be spending 20, 30, 40,000 pounds a year on. And of course, budgets for schooling are never that much, even if you're at an independent school. There's no way they can then charge that level of fee, really. So I think moving forwards, it is going to be difficult. Now people have seen the possibilities and been given the taste of it. There will be probably a hunger. And it's going to be quite difficult, I think, to reconcile that. Similarly, if their children are ill for some reason, then they're suddenly expecting these wonderful learning packages and so on. As I say, I just don't see how in any education system you could usefully provide that at any kind of reasonable cost to the taxpayer or parents. So yeah, I think it's cutting our coat according to our cloth. Eleanor, I've got a really interesting question here from Shiyu Zhu, who's asking, it says, during the pandemic, many students had problems with interpersonal security, and I think they mean insecurity. What do you think about that, and what could teachers do to support children in that respect?
I think that's very true, that it was rather scary for children when they got to year 7 and leaving year 6 having not seen their friends the way they should have seen them. And what I'm always saying anyway, but it's even more relevant in COVID days, is what teachers can do is to focus on the child as a social being rather than, as you were saying earlier, as a statistic. And some children have missed out on that because they've been on their own during lockdowns. But as you were saying earlier, yeah, focus on the well-being of the children rather than just their academic work. Of course, that's really important too. And also, in one of my studies, I discovered this was not a COVID year, but at the end of year 3, some of the children didn't know other children in their class. And I found that really baffling. These are 7-year-olds, and it's probably just didn't occur to the teacher to play some games or do some activities where you actually get to know who that is sitting in that desk 2 rows behind you. So I think more emphasis on that, even though it might eat into some time that you would otherwise be spending on the curriculum.
Yeah, because you're building a group, aren't you?
Yes, you would hope so. You would hope so. Yeah.
Can I just add to that? One of the things I'm worried about is that because I think Eleanor's right, and I think this year the year 7s probably have a smaller group of friends than they might have had by this point in secondary school. They might have stuck, for example, with their old school friends and not particularly made new ones. And what I really worry about is that when they go into year 8, particularly if life appears to be normalising, the effort won't be put into still building those relationships, because the assumption is usually by the beginning of year 8 that everybody's settled in their new friendship groups. I imagine there'll be a lot of focus on the new year 7s, but we mustn't forget the current cohort are the ones that have been through it first, and they need, they continue to have these problems probably throughout their schooling.
And especially Jane,
sorry, I was going to say, we've had a question from a member of the public, so I'm really glad you brought this up. Eleanor, I'm wondering how you think we might be able to best support that kind of social adjustment from year 7 to year 8? Should there be a special transition programme for that year group?
Well, perhaps there should. I'm very aware from my own children and general knowledge that year 8 is a particularly difficult year, I think, especially for boys, but it's when you're going through so many changes. So the year 8s need extra social support anyway. So I think that yes, there should be a special transition program. I mean, something that the children mentioned in the survey was that they really liked it when it was only the year 7s at school, a few of them said, and or the year 7s and the 6th form. And it may be that something like that could be done for the year 8s. I mean, we've looked, haven't we, Sandy, at the idea of there being a kind of separate unit for year 7s, which would be a sort of bridge between year 6 and year 8. And that would also suggest that as they leave that and go into the big school of year 8, it would be very appropriate to have some special transition preparation. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, actually.
Yeah, and we found quite a lot out about that, didn't we, Jane? And about things like play and so on.
Absolutely, and the fact that they moved from primary school to secondary school and immediately stopped playing in a very mysterious way. I think, just returning back to what to do about this year's year 8 and the transition, I just think that individual schools can look at what year 7s didn't get the chance to do and build in opportunities to do those things in year 8. One example in one of the interviews was that one school usually had at the beginning of year 7 a camping trip away, hoping the weather was nice in September, and that was designed for all these little strangers to get to know each other. And I think they are still, to a certain extent, still little strangers, and they could do that at the beginning of year 8. So, I mean, obviously, we can't be still having transition programs for them right up until year 11 because they missed out this year. But schools could certainly see what they missed out on and see if they can replace them.
Yeah, maybe it's about having repeated opportunities because there might be cancellations of things as well. So just to embed it a little bit, I suppose. Now, I'm getting a lot of questions in where people are wanting some tips. So I'm having one question here. What sort of transition support is there in relation to homework expectations, independent work at home in secondary? Now, I know we got some data on this, didn't we? So what tips could we give maybe year 6 and year 7 teachers about managing those homework expectations, because some children are quite frightened of the homework.
Yes, certainly children I've talked to, often when I said, what are you worried about transitioning to secondary school, the answer was the homework and the work being too hard. And I was amazed in the survey responses that we had, the children, when we asked them, what did your primary school do that helped you with transition? They said, gave us harder work and gave us detentions and were more strict. A lot of them said that. And so they really felt that, they needed preparation. So it seems that some schools were giving extra homework as they got nearer to secondary school. And the children loved it.
But some didn't like the detention thing. I mean, that was quoted as something that was a bit daunting for them. And some of them, the conversation that they'd had with primary school was, yeah, be very scared of big school. Detentions will happen and you might get bullied. I mean, it's not the most positive of framings, perhaps, for the secondary school career. What do you think, Jane?
I think in terms of homework, it's important to make it a gradual increase if it is going to increase through Key Stage 3. I would also want to suggest that perhaps homework isn't as important as we all think it is, and that perhaps certainly this year, I know some schools have actually probably cut back on the homework, and certainly did following the most recent lockdown, because if students had spent all their time at home hunched over laptops, doing schoolwork, they didn't want them to have to do that again. And that's a this year thing, but ongoing, I just think that hopefully, well, if the year 6 schools and the year 7 schools can talk to each other about custom and practice, and obviously there are lots of feeder schools, then there can be some recognition that it needs to be gradual, I think.
Yeah, and the evidence, the research evidence is that certainly in primary, homework doesn't bear fruit, especially if it's just given regularly rather than for a particular reason. And I understand that carries on. It only becomes really useful when you get near your GCSEs, according to research. So yeah, I think that's a really good idea, Jane. The year 7 teachers, rather than giving loads at the beginning, which I think some schools do, could do it the opposite way around. Why do they need to give any to start with? You've got all those years to get used to it. I don't think there's a mad rush. So yeah, that's a really good idea.
And sometimes it's a matter of school and managing parents' expectations as well with things like homework. Some people like to see the children work quite hard and feel that they're making the best possible progress. But this is a really interesting natural experiment where we try different things and see if the progress still happens. So it would be interesting to review it all in a year's time. We've got another question from Sarah, who's saying, did we find any great examples of workarounds, for example, tech platforms to support social and emotional learning needs during the pandemic? I remember one, I think, where a child reported that her parents had bought her a special online course in how to move to secondary school and all about that. Yeah. I can't remember the name of the course, but the parents had provided that rather than the school, and she felt that had been helpful. Can you think of any more, Jane?
No, there was a lot of talk about, in terms of the technology, how useful it was if primary and secondary schools had common systems that they were using. And therefore there could be a smooth transition, and that wasn't all strange, but that wasn't necessarily anything in particular to do with transition and well-being. I don't think it came up that much in the data, and that's actually quite a big gap, isn't it?
Yeah, we did get stuff on platforms, so Google Classroom seemed to be at the top in the popularity stakes, but not on the social and emotional aspects.
No, I wonder if there are companies beavering away at developing such things right now.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Now we've only got a few more minutes, so what I wanted to do is to go to each of you in turn, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about best practice examples, so the absolute take-home tips now. What are the things that really stood out in the research project as the most valuable transition activities that teachers can do, perhaps in a normalised approach or as a hybrid approach if the pandemic drags on even further? What do you think should be happening? Let's start with Jane.
Well, I think that we know that successful transition relies on managing children's expectations of secondary school, and also ensuring some sort of continuity of learning. So as much as schools can do to familiarise upcoming year sixes with the new school situation. And we did see some good examples of how that was done online last time. I mean, there was one school that was actually doing daily online videos, and we've had schools doing videos, virtual tours of their schools. There was one school that had a message from year 7 being played to year 6s, and that was all good online stuff. And I guess at the moment we can only really talk about online because as we know, it's not really happening this year either. And in terms of the continuity of learning, it's keeping that dialogue and communication between the schools, so that the new schools know how far that is possible, that the children as much as they can before they get there. But that's easier said than done.
Eleanor, what are your?
I think it's really important for teachers and parents to be getting children to talk about their feelings and their expectations and their fears, especially their fears, because they may think that they shouldn't feel afraid or that nobody else is feeling afraid, it's just them. And I did a survey with my 23 the children in my other study, and half of them said that they were terrified about bullies in secondary school, which is really sad. And I think to be able to talk about it as an issue with other people or just with your teacher is really useful. One little boy I was talking to about transitioning, all his other friends were going to one secondary school and he was going to a different one where he didn't know anyone. And I said, and how do you feel about it? He said, fine. I said, really, you're not anxious or anything like that? He said, well, I try and push it down. So he felt that he ought to be able to cope, and that is the message we give children, endurance, resilience. You should be able to cope, you shouldn't feel afraid. But I think we need to pop that bubble a bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because studies that go on to do with grit, the idea of grit and character building.
Exactly.
But maybe character building is sometimes knowing when to ask for help.
Yes, I
knowing
totally
when
agree with you,
look
Stan.
for a solution rather than pretending that the problem isn't there and gritting your teeth. So last messages for people. Should we speak to parents now? What should we say to parents?
It's been a very difficult year. It needs to be acknowledged. Just keep talking to them about, as Eleanor said, about how they're feeling. Support them as much as you can, but don't feel guilty when you can't. I mean, as a parent myself, it was very difficult doing lockdown homeschooling, and I know a lot of people were driving themselves mad trying to deal with it. I mean, I think the most important part that parents can play is emotional support at home, and not beat themselves up too much about the maths.
You can never be perfect, can you, as a parent? Eleanor, what would you say?
I would say congratulations to all parents who've done such an amazing job without training, and we've seen that for a lot of children it's been highly successful. So congratulations. I'm not sure I could have home educated my daughters. You wouldn't have listened to a word I said. So I do recognise how challenging it is. So brilliant.
Well, we've had training, and Jane and I both had.
Yeah, and we've had training. Yes.
And, you know, I got feedback and I was told that, you know, with a bit more practice, I could be okay, you know. So, especially, you know, I had a lot to learn in maths and science, you know, and I take the criticism. It was very, very difficult, and it's amazing children have done as well as they have. And we might be pleasantly surprised, I think, moving forwards about what a terrific and compassionate bunch of young people that have come through this. So very sadly, we're running out of time, so we'll need to leave it there. Thank you for all your comments and questions. We really appreciate that. And thank you to our speakers, Eleanor Hargreaves and Jane Perryman. Please stay safe, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.